Okay, and we're live. And today I just wanted to, excuse me, talk a little bit about a topical issue and incorporate it into my series on the Quran because this is a current problem. These aren't just things that were practiced in the past. Unfortunately, Islam is a very widespread religion, and the people who are Muslims take the Quran, a lot of them take the Quran very seriously and the Hadith, and they put into practice the things that they were admonished to by Muhammad and his followers, and the Islamic scholars. So the BBC just did an undercover documentary where they sent a crew to Iraq, to the Shiite heartland, Karbala, the Qadamiyya district in Baghdad. This is the heart of Shia Islam inside of Iraq. It's the equivalent of Qom in Iran, where most of the high-ranking clerics teach and have their mosques. So they sent a crew there, and they did an undercover investigation wherein they found most of the Shiite clerics, at least the ones that they encountered, were willing to engage in nikah mutah, or pleasure marriages, arrange these marriages with girls as young as 12, 13, 14, girls who are minors. And they were willing to arrange these marriages at ostensibly the holiest sites in Shia Islam. Oh, hi, First Corinthians. And none of the clerics turned them down. None of them, and several of them were followers of Ayatollah Sistani, who is the chief Shia cleric inside of Iraq. And you may remember him because he had an important role after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the occupation of Iraq. The US and allies used Ayatollah Sistani to control rebellion within southern Iraq, particularly the resistance and the attacks by Muqtada al-Sadr, who is the son of a famous Shiite cleric killed by Saddam Hussein. So he's a very, very important, very high-ranking cleric, Shiite cleric, kind of I think they're called Marhas, one of the most important ayatollahs in the world. And the followers of his who were clerics were willing to arrange nikah mutah, despite the fact that these girls were obviously not marriageable age. And in fact, even in Iraq, this is something that's forbidden, despite the fact that it's a majority Shia country. Legally, you're not allowed to do it, but they found this practice to be widespread. And the followers of Sistani were willing to arrange these pleasure marriages, which in essence is a form of prostitution that's sanctioned within Islam. And Ayatollah Sistani issued a statement rejecting what they were doing, but he didn't reject the concept of nikah mutah or pleasure marriage. He said, we reject these type of things if they go against the dignity of women. So, in other words, the concept of Nikamuta, which is a very roundabout way of sanctioning prostitution, that concept is okay, but what they were doing is not okay, according to him. Now, I don't know whether that was simply because it reflected badly on him and he really does endorse this, or he was being sincere. But in either case, it comes down to the fact that you have the grand Ayatollah in Iraq essentially endorsing prostitution. And this is looked down upon in Sunni Islam, and it's usually thought of as a Shiite institution. But the truth is, it's a Shiite institution because it's a Muslim institution. And this was an idea that was practiced by Muhammad and his followers. And some people think it was outlawed under one of his successors, Omar, but it was never, it was never, it was never banned while Muhammad was alive. And in fact, Muhammad did engage engage in these practices. His followers engaged in these practices when they were at war. They would take pleasure brides, even though Nikamuta itself, the institution, is something that was adopted by Shiite Muslims, and it's scorned by Sunnis. Just because it's a Shiite institution doesn't mean it's not valid within the confines of Islamic teaching. In the same way that taqiyya, or dissimulation, it's something that's been adopted by the Shiites, usually when they're in a country where they're subject to persecution. So, say a country like Syria, which up until the 20th century would have been controlled by Sunni Muslims, or in a country like Iraq, which was ruled by a clique of Sunni, albeit secular Muslims. You'd be able to lie and dissimulate, and in order to survive. But again, even though this is a Shiite institution, the concept is grounded in Islamic practice, particularly the practices of Muhammad and his followers. And you can look back to his sojourn in Medina, and when he was under duress, when he didn't have the manpower to actually engage in battle, he would make temporary truces with his enemies in order to gather strength. So before he could go on the offensive. So this concept of taqiyya, just like the concept of Nikamuta, even though they're associated with Shia Islam and scorned, that doesn't mean that they're not grounded in Islamic principles. And you can see that when you actually study the history of Muhammad and how he and his companions and their followers interacted. So the first the first real Muslims, you can see what they did and what they endorsed, and kind of extrapolate extrapolate from that. So in Surah 2, in Surah 2, 225, it says, Allah does not call you to account for what is vain in your oaths, but he will call you to account for what your hearts have earned, and Allah is forgiving, forbearing. Now, this verse is very generic. It's hard to understand without consulting the hadith and looking at the history of Muhammad. It's just a very general statement saying that Allah is not going to hold you accountable for what's vain in your oath. So in other words, if you're lying, but you don't really mean it, then Allah is not going to punish you for that. Now, that concept itself is problematic when you understand that God commands people not to lie. So just making a practice of lying, even if it's a statement that you make insincerely, it's something pretending to not follow a certain religion in order to spare your life. This is something that would be unfathomable to someone who's steeped in scripture. Hi, Irene. Yeah, like I said, like it says, Allah is the best of deceivers. In my translation, it says the best of planners, but like I said, my translation was actually published by a Dawah organization that's affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, basically that branch. It's from, where is it? The distributors and publishers. It's from Elmhurst, but it was published also in Pakistan and Iran, and it's affiliated with a very revanchist, expansionist form of Islam that isn't that truthful about its intentions. So the translation is not that great, but it's not trying to impugn Muhammad, the motives of Muhammad or Islam. It's actually trying to downplay the bad side. So it says Allah is the best of planners. The actual word, the actual sentence is Allah is the best of deceivers, and you'll see that in other translations. But it's true that this concept of deception and dissimulation, it's ingrained in not only the Quran, but the Hadith. In Sahih Bukhari 52:269, it's a quote, and it says, "The Prophet said, war is deceit." And that was the animating principle of Muhammad during warfare, to deceive and to mislead people in trying to gain an edge over his enemies. So he would make treaties that he had no intention of keeping. He would attack people who were his ostensible allies. In Sahih Bukhari 84:64-65, it says, Ali said that lying is permitted to deceive an enemy. So you could say, in this case, Taqiyya, the equivalent of dissimulation. And you could say, well, this is Ali, this is some of the Shiites revere, but although all Muslims theoretically they should revere the first four, what they call the rightly guided caliphs, but Ali is a particular fixture for Shiite Muslims, because they believe he was the rightful inheritor of Muhammad's. He was the rightful inheritor of the caliphate, the Muhammad's what Muhammad had succeeded in conquering, and not Muawiyah, who fought Ali and eventually established his own caliphate. Ali was killed not by not by his forces, but by a renegade group who disagreed with the idea of arbitration and negotiation between the two sides. But even though it's Ali speaking, he's speaking from the authority of what Muhammad had laid down. So even if you want to say things like Taqiyya or Nikah Mutah, and there's a somewhat similar practice in Sunni Islam called Nikah Mizyar, which is not as widespread, but it shares a it shares a disregard for the idea of marriage and looking at marriage as this sort of malleable, subjective institution that's only there in order to benefit men instead of a sacramental union, something that's ordained by God. In Islam, it's looked at more as a way to propagate the religion and as something that's useful for men. It's kind of analogous to the way that marriage was looked at in ancient Greece. And I'm not saying all Islamic marriages are like that, but that was how it was envisioned by Muhammad, definitely. And you can see that in his own life, where he had uh, over a dozen wives and numerous concubines, and he even invented a revelation when he laid with Mary the Copt in and Aisha discovered this and told one of his wives about this, that he had slept in her bed with a slave girl. He even invented revelation sanctioning that. So, I mean, that's what Muhammad thought of marriage. I thought Mutah was only for wartime. Yeah, that would be the argument that particularly Sunnis would use, that this was something that was ordained for a specific time period, a temporal arrangement that expired once Muslims weren't constantly at war, I guess. But I don't know. It's not really a persuasive argument when you really look at it, because Muhammad never said that this was a temporary um, feature of a marital contract, a nikah, that once the Muslims had conquered all of. Well, I mean, that's another question. Like, if it's only valid during war, when is it not valid? Because I mean, there are always, for the first 200 years of Islam, Muslims were just out trying to seize land and conquer land and invading Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent and North Africa. So there was never a time when they really were completely at peace. Peace was more of a interim arrangement, but it's also not really a compelling argument when you look at it that way, because there are things that Muhammad said, or verses of the Quran that he abrogated. Now, temporary marriage is something that's alluded to. It's not explicitly stated in the Quran, but it is alluded to, particularly when Muhammad is describing what is acceptable in warfare, and taking spoils, and part of the spoils is sex slaves And part of that also, and this is something that's not elaborated upon in the Quran itself, but having temporary brides. So this wasn't this was something that was couched in the context of warfare, but Muhammad never said that it wasn't applicable outside of that context. So you would have to draw your own conclusions. And this is why I think the Sunni perspective is actually the not doesn't have as much fidelity to Muhammad's life and example as the Shia perspective. Shias are often thought of as heretics, particularly by Sunni Muslims, although that's not a universal sentiment, particularly in the West. But a lot of Sunnis do feel, and this is why you had people like Zarqawi trying to start a civil war, basically, in Iraq by bombing Shiite mosques, destroying the minarets, waging war in places like Karbala and densely populated Shiite areas, and particularly groups like ISIS, the most quote unquote extreme Sunni jihadist groups, will wage a war on Shiites. And this is a big problem in Pakistan as well. Rival jihadist groups, Shia and Sunni, attacking each other. So Shia are often seen by a significant percentage of Sunnis as not being real Muslims. But I think when you look at something like this, like Taqiyya, Mutah, even though these are ingrained practices in Shiite Islam, they're Shiite practices because they're Muslim practices. These are just things that the Shiites never forsook. But I think they have a much better argument for clinging to these practices than the Sunnis do for abandoning them. It's permissible in Shia law. In fact, Iran, they're trying to. I think recently the Majlis, the parliament, tried to pass a law legitimating these contracts. I don't think it's officially legal, but like this BBC undercover documentary exposed, it's pretty much unpunished. So young girls are sold into sex slavery and these prostitution contracts without any sort of intervention by the state. So even though it's not technically legal, it is still widely practiced, particularly in Shia culture. And there's something similar that the Sunnis do called nikah mizyar, which isn't as widespread, but it's still pretty much endorsed by Shiite clergy, and Shiites accept it, at least overseas. It's considered still valid. Islam is bandit theology. Yeah, I mean, this is why a lot of people think that Islam was simply the doctrinal aspects of Islam were grafted on to a kind of pre-existing warrior culture led by Muhammad. But in terms of nikah mutah, that isn't officially legal, but in places like Iran and Iraq and in Shiite majority countries, it's still widely practiced, as this BBC documentary uncovered. And David Wood made an interesting video about this where he pointed out that there was an e-petition to have this documentary removed from the BBC. And it's ironic because the BBC is usually the chief apologist for Islam, regardless. And they have this group of angry Shia. And the Shia aren't angry that their sect does this. They're angry that a Western TV network has exposed it for the rest of the world. And it shows you the priorities of Islam. And like I said, I just want to make this video to clarify some things, because I think a lot of people think this is just a Shiite idea, but the reason it's a Shiite practice is because it's an Islamic practice. They basically, in the same way that when people say ISIS, they try to takfir ISIS or Al Qaeda and say they're not Muslim. They are Muslims. They're just Muslims that are consistent in their application of Islam. The UK grooming gangs, again, that's another example. And most of the people who are involved in that, I think, are Sunni Muslims. They're Pakistanis. But that's another example of Islam's approach. Things like grooming gangs are explicitly sanctioned. If you go to the Quran and the Hadith, and some Muslim apologists will say, well, the ones who are trying to defend Islam will say that this is only valid for warfare. It doesn't really apply in Western culture. But again, there's nothing that Muhammad said that would have nullified these ideas if they were taken out of the context of war. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And it's true. It is generally more merciful. A lot of Indian, particularly Hindu nationalists, will bring up British colonialism. But if you actually examine how India was treated by the British colonial, and I'm not saying the Raj system was something to be envied. There were certainly horrible practices, horrible things that the British did, but it didn't even compare to the brutality of the Mughal dynasty, particularly an emperor like Aurangzeb, who was one of the most brutal Muslim emperors. And the Indian Holocaust, they don't even have a reliable statistic on how many Hindus and Buddhists and non-Muslims were killed in that. It ranges anywhere from 20 million to 100 million, but it's at least 3 or 4 times the number of Jews that were massacred by Nazi Germany, and at least twice as much as the 10 to 12 million people, including the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. So even the worst of British colonialism was not as bad as Muslim rule. And well, some Hindu nationalists will admit that because they're very anti-Islam, but a lot of Indians, particularly progressive Indians like Arundhati Roy Ra, they'll depict England as some sort of proto-Nazi regime during the colonial era, when it's not even comparable, their rule and the rule of Islam, which just left a wake of corpses. And Robert Spencer explores this in his book, The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS, which I would recommend to everyone. Anyway, I'm glad everyone who joined, Andrew, Irene, defending Christianity, First Corinthians. Like I said, share. Uh, I've been losing subscribers, even though I don't have that many to begin with. But so feel free to share this if you enjoyed the video, and I'll get back to reading the surah. I think the next surah is Yasin. I'll read that in my next video. Take care.